Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. My guest this episode is North Dakota Department of Corrections head Leann Bertsch. Now, she's going to be on to talk about a debate that the legislature's been having about the Dakota Women's Correctional Facility in New England, North Dakota. It's as you could probably guess from the title, it's a women's prison. It's not actually run by the state. It's owned by a consortium of western counties that has had a contract with the state for about 15 years where the state pays them to house our female prisoners. Now, Governor Doug Burgum, in his executive budget, introduced some funding to reshuffle and move away from that facility, move the women out of that facility, move them to an existing facility in Missouri that houses, or along the Missouri River near Bismarck, that houses, it's called the Missouri River Correctional Facility, that currently houses men near Bismarck, and then move those men to a new facility in Jamestown. And the reason why they want to move away from the facility in New England is there's a lot of reasons. They have to do with cost. They have to do with how isolated the prison is. They have to do with the difficulty in recruiting prison guards. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to move away from it, but probably the most important reason is the conditions for the female prisoners there. Now, when you listen to this interview with Leann Bertsch, she's going to say some things that are going to raise your eyebrows. She's going to tell you that she feels that this current facility is violating the Eighth Amendment rights of those prisoners. She is going to tell you that about a woman who feels that her dental care was so bad she had to take matters into her own hands. It's pretty shocking stuff. You're going to want to stay tuned for that. But before we get to the interview, a rant. Now, here in North Dakota, we had, during the 2018 election cycle, we had a big debate about voter ID laws. And it became national news because we had one of the hottest U.S. Senate races in the country between Kevin Cramer and Heidi Heitkamp. Kevin Cramer ultimately won that race, but not before a lot of accusations were being thrown around about North Dakota's voter ID laws and how that they were formulated to supposedly suppress the Native American vote and suppress Heidi Heitkamp voters. And it was all, this partisan machination to basically disenfranchise voters who might cast their ballots for Democrats and Heidi Heitkamp specifically. Now, we held the election, and we know what actually happened in Native American communities is that turnout broke records. So if the intent of the North Dakota legislature in implementing these voter ID laws was to suppress votes, they failed miserably because with just a little bit of organization, voter turnout broke records. And to me, that outcome just frankly proved that, hey, the law is actually pretty easy to comply with. You put a little bit of effort into it, you comply with the law. It is very easy to vote in North Dakota. In fact, I would argue, due to our lack of voter registration, among other things, it's easier to vote in North Dakota than it is in just about any other state in the union. But what's interesting is there's a new working paper out published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they find that voter ID laws, quote, have no negative effect on registration or turnout overall or for any group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. Now, the researchers made some 1.3 billion observations from elections, collecting in elections from 2008 to 2016, and they use these observations to support their argument. They say in the description of the working paper, I quote, these results hold through a large number of specifications and cannot be attributed to mobilization against the laws measured by campaign contributions and self-reported political engagement. Now, of course, I should add here that before voter ID supporters like myself get too excited, there's also this, I quote, ID requirements have no effect on fraud either, actual or perceived. So, I guess the most compelling, usually when we hear people arguing against the voter ID laws, they're talking about voter suppression and these evil efforts to get out and suppress the vote. And it turns out, at least according to this working paper, a lot of that stuff is kind of bunk. In fact, the most compelling argument opponents of voter ID laws can make against them based on this data is that they don't really do anything, or they don't change much of anything, I should say. Now, I would argue that I don't know that we need fraud to happen in order for us to have in place voter ID laws. Listen, in the law are requirements that you have to be a certain age to vote, right? That you have to have a certain residency in our state to vote in North Dakota, right? And you have to live, if you want to vote in a particular legislative district, for instance, you actually have to live in that legislative district. You can't just cross town, if there's not a legislative race in your district that year, you can't just cross town and vote in the competitive race across town. That's not how it works. And to me, if we're going to have those requirements in the law, that all of those things are true, then we should have a way to verify that. And the easiest way to verify that, at least the starting point, is an ID requirement. But what frustrates me is, again, during the election, we saw all of these national headlines, right? We had these national reporters airdropping into North Dakota, telling us all about how our laws, they're racist, right? And it was taken as an article of faith, right? I mean, it was just reported as fact that the motivation behind North Dakota's voter ID law was racism, that the motivation behind North Dakota's voter ID law was to suppress votes. And I think what we're finding out is, not just from the election outcome, where it turned out Native Americans didn't have that hard of a time voting at all, but what we also found out from this research is that voter ID laws don't even have that effect across the country. So that's the frustrating thing. And I think maybe what it tells us is a little bit of something about the way the media latches on to a narrative, right? Because I really think a lot of the reporting about voter ID laws in North Dakota was about narrative amid the hothouse of an election, amid the hothouse of a, extremely competitive U.S. Senate race. And they latched onto a narrative. They knew it would get a lot of clicks. And certainly it was a narrative Senator Heitkamp and her crowd were pushing because, it was convenient for them. But the truth, it turned out, was something much different. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about before the interview is the civil asset forfeiture issue. Now, there's been a debate going on in Bismarck. House Bill 1286, introduced by State Representative Rick Becker, Republican from Bismarck, would require a conviction before law enforcement can forfeit, you should hear that as keep, property or cash seized during a criminal proceeding. And it would also put in place some reporting requirements for the way civil asset forfeiture is used in the state. Because right now, it's hard to quantify how often this is happening, how much property is being seized. We really don't know because there's no uniform reporting requirements where we could go to one place and get a report and say, okay, well, here's how much it's being used, and here's how the money's being used and everything else. We just don't have that now. The bill so far, it did well in the House Judiciary Committee. It emerged with an 11-3 due pass. And as I record this on what I'm assuming will be the last day of floor session for the State House before they adjourn for the crossover break, the bill should be coming up for a floor vote. I suspect it will probably pass the House. Last year, a similar version passed in the State House, 50-42. It failed, unfortunately, though, in the Senate without getting a single vote in favor of it after what was a pretty heavy lobbying effort from law enforcement. But whatever happens with that bill, and by the way, we've debated it a lot. In fact, I had on a previous episode of Plain Talk, State's Attorney Ladd Erickson, a prosecutor from Western North Dakota, as well as Defense Attorney Mark Fries. Both men work with the forfeiture laws in North Dakota all the time. They debated the issue. But I think something that the U.S. Supreme Court just did should maybe give lawmakers some extra impetus to push on this issue this year. Timms versus Indiana, it's a criminal case that made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, wherein a man who was ultimately fined $10,000 after being convicted of drug charges saw the state try to forfeit his $40,000 Land Rover. Now, what the Supreme Court has done is they have a unanimous decision, meaning all the justices were on board with this. They held that the Eighth Amendment's protections against cruel and unusual punishment would apply to this situation. Now, it was a narrow ruling. What the Supreme Court did not do is they did not decide that the defendant in Timms v. Indiana, that his Eighth Amendment rights specifically were violated by this specific forfeiture. All that they said is that the Eighth Amendment is incorporated to the states, and then they remanded the case back to the lower court saying, please take another look at this in light of us saying that the Eighth Amendment applies. So we don't really have a good outcome from that. But I feel like we can kind of see which way the wind's blowing. And it sure seems to me that a forfeiture that is worth 4 times what the person's fine was for the crime itself is probably not something that's going to stand up under Eighth Amendment scrutiny. Of course, Eighth Amendment is the protection against cruel and unusual punishment and excessive fines. So if that's an excessive fine, then here in North Dakota, where law enforcement is allowed to forfeit property without a conviction at all, You wouldn't think that that would stand up to Eighth Amendment scrutiny either, right? If you're convicted of a crime and the property that law enforcement takes from you and keeps is worth multiples of what you were fined with for the crime, I think most of us could say that that's excessive and it's unconstitutional under the Eighth Amendment. But how about if the government takes something from you and you weren't even convicted of anything? Or maybe, as the case may be, you weren't even charged with anything. And by the way, that happens in North Dakota. Last year, we had reports of a man who was acquitted of charges related to the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. He had been charged with some crimes. Doesn't matter what they are now because he was acquitted from them. But the state of North Dakota was trying to keep his pickup truck anyway. Now, that's not fair. How can that be fair if you're not even convicted of a crime? And yet, what we hear from law enforcement, including Mr. Erickson, who I consider to be a friend and a good person, but what they argue is that they need the ability to forfeit without a conviction because it facilitates, crimes that may cross jurisdictional boundaries, and it just makes their lives a whole lot easier. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not sure that law enforcement convenience rises to the level of allowing them to violate our constitutional rights. So anyway, it's an interesting case, and I certainly hope that civil asset forfeiture reform passes in the legislature this year. We'll see what's happened. It's very much in doubt at this point. That's it for the rant. We'll have Leann Bertsch coming up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Leann Bertsch is the director of North Dakota's Department of Corrections. Now, she's been doing a great job. And Leann, first of all, thank you for your time today to do a little interview with me. And I think you've been doing great work reforming North Dakota's corrections system. You've gotten some national attention even out of it. I don't think you've been getting enough attention. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
There's been a debate in the legislature, and your boss, Governor Doug Burgum, I kicked it off. He included in his executive budget funding to do sort of a reshuffling of our prisons. Essentially, we're going to move some female prisoners out of under his plan, move some female prisoners out of a facility in New England, North Dakota, move them to a facility that currently houses men near Bismarck, and move those men to a facility in Jamestown. And there's funding to make all of that happen. But there's been some resistance to that, and I wanted to talk with you about it. And first of all, maybe start with just having you explain, why is all that reshuffling necessary?
So right now, the women who are incarcerated within the Department of Corrections are in a contract facility. It's not a state-owned facility. It's a facility that's owned by a consortium of 6 counties that run the Southwest Multi-Correctional Center out in Dickinson, and that's the parent. And back in 2003, the Department of Corrections, when the women who are incarcerated, that population was growing, and the Department of Corrections came in with a plan that would have remodeled an existing building on the campus of the James River Correctional Center and the State Hospital, which would have been turned into a facility designed and made for women. At that time, the Southwest Multi-Correctional Center came in the middle of the session and said, hey, we can do it for $35 a day. They're over $130 today. And that all it'll take is a lick of paint. And there was no study back then, and the Department of Corrections resisted that move, but basically they voted to put the facility out there for economic purposes and jobs, knowing that the services were limited. So the Department of Corrections has lived with that contract for the last 15 years, but it's become more and more apparent that we have some extreme parity issues between the services that are offered the men and the services that are offered to the women. And even if you could just throw money at it and buy all the services for the women, the fact of the matter is that the women are so far away, the logistics of that facility is so far away from their children and their family members, that they don't have the same opportunities to stay connected to their families, which is a huge indicator of future success for women.
Tell us about the parity issues between men and women. What exactly are you talking about?
So, for example, in our male facilities, which are located, 2 of them are located in Bismarck and the other facility is located in Jamestown, we have way more opportunities for educational, work release opportunities, mental, medical opportunities, behavioral health opportunities. So here in Bismarck, we have a large number of our minimum security men work on work release, but we also have a lot more with even in our maximum security facilities. So for even example, at the North Dakota State Penitentiary, if you have a long sentence, say 10 to 20 years, you still have the opportunities to work in industries, learn a welding trade, learn AutoCAD, learn woodworking, learn anything with industries. So if you're a woman out in New England and you have a long sentence, those long sentence individuals are in the housing unit that's in the basement of an old Catholic boarding school. It's limited light. Those women are not allowed to work in, there's very limited work opportunities because they're not of the custody level where they can come upstairs and actually work off-site in the industries, because most of their industries are off-site. They have some limited sewing opportunities. So they have very limited opportunities for educational and vocational programs. And in fact, the Department of Public Instructions, when they actually went out and did an assessment on their GED program at the women's facility, it was so far behind, they basically advised improve it or shut the program down. And so we've had our education staff on the road for the last year trying to get them up to par. And then it's just very, very difficult in the rural areas of state, and that's very rural, to really meet the needs of the behavioral health needs. And a large percentage of our women have some pretty significant behavioral health needs, and so they have very limited services at that facility. They don't have a dental operatory on site. So, for example, they have to load up the women in a van and they take them down to Bowman, a 50-mile drive from the facility. And during the public hearing that we had in the House, one of our former residents, one of the ladies, stood up and said that there's such a long waiting list that she actually had to pull her own tooth because she was in such pain because she didn't ever get to the dentist. So there's significant issues. I think that if the state punts and doesn't do something this time, that even before we come back to session, that there probably be some legal action started by our existing residents. We've went through that before. I think we're at risk to do that again.
Well, I was just going to mention that we've been sued. The state of, when I say we, the state of North Dakota has been sued before because of a lack of parity in treatment between female and male prisoners before. And Right. You're saying essentially we're ripe for that again, barring absent some action from the legislature.
We are. So, for example, it's absolutely an Eighth Amendment right to have access to the community level standard of care for medical and dental services. I don't believe we're meeting that in that facility. Right now, we offer, so if a man comes into custody and is on methadone or some sort of medication-assisted treatment, we are able to provide that at the state penitentiary and the Missouri River Correctional Center. They do not have medication-assisted treatment at this time down in New England. So that's another parity issue, and that's also an ADA issue as well. So and then the other piece of it is, even if you could get all those services down there, 90% of the women are from Mandan East. 31% of them are from Bismarck, Mandan alone, and then the rest of them are from the center of the state east. And so we've compared the visitation rates that the women are able to have with the men, and they're getting visits with their families at a fraction of the rate that the men are able to maintain those family connections with their kids and family.
It's interesting you said the visitation issue, because I think that's very important. I think for a long time, as we've debated criminal justice reform nationally, as we've debated it in the state, we've talked about the need to rehabilitate prisoners. An important part of that is them maintaining contact to the positive members of their circle, family, non-criminal friends, people like that, if they're isolated in a facility that is difficult for those people to travel to, they're not going to get that. Now, but one rebuttal I heard to that during legislative testimony on this proposal was that, a lot of these prisoners, they don't want their family, they don't want their children or whoever to see them in prison. So this visitation issue, it's not that big of an issue.
It's a huge issue. And in fact, the number one stressor on women in prison is the lack of access to their children. And we know what the research indicates is that parental incarceration is a strong risk factor for a number of adverse outcomes for children. So it's not only just about the women, it's the access that the children still need to have that parent in their life. And if you actually make the facility child-friendly, and if you visited our visitation rooms here at the State Penitentiary, down at JRCC or MRCC, we've done a lot to make them family-friendly, and we do a lot of events that make it fun for kids to come visit their fathers. We do pumpkin baking, Christmas decorating. We have movie nights for them. We have a lot of activities that are age appropriate so that it's fun for the children to come visit their parents, and the children really appreciate that as well as the parents do. And it's really, really important for their relationship after. And one of the biggest stressors that women will cite coming out of prison is that they've had so little access to their children while they're incarcerated that they find it difficult to parent them when they do return to the community, which adds a whole another level of stress and probably helps them and really impacts their ability to succeed. And a lot of them just say, I'm give up. I can't even deal with the stressors of raising my young kids because I no longer know them as a parent.
The State House just voted this week to study this issue instead of taking action on it, which I will tell you as an observer frustrates me because I share your view of this issue that we've got to do something about this to bring treatment of prisoners back up to parity. But I look at the political situation and I see sort of a two-pronged problem that really is an obstacle to solving this problem. One is economic considerations. We're hearing a lot from people saying these jobs in western North Dakota are important. If we get rid of this facility, we're going to lose those jobs. We're going to lose the commerce that it drives. And there's just a lot of resistance based on that. And you wouldn't think that would matter, but I'm guessing that legislators who aren't from New England have spending programs or pet projects in their districts that they don't want to put at risk either. So we have this sort of parochial horse trading going on. And then I think the other problem is there's a public perception that there's a quote from The Shawshank Redemption about, I think one of the guards makes a joke when Andy Dufresne, the character, is writing the state legislature to get funding for a library in the prison. I think the warden or one of the guards, I'm forgetting which character says it, but basically says, the only thing the public wants for prisons is more walls, more bars, and more guards. Do you think that attitude is common? I mean, is that an obstacle to trying? Because what you're talking about is let's make it fun for the kids to come visit the prisoners. Let's educate them. Let's do all these things. And are there people out there thinking, well, these are people who did bad things. Why are we doing nice things for them?
Yeah, I still think that there's that attitude. I think we've made some progress, but there certainly is the attitude that individuals who are sentenced to prison do not deserve some of the things that we provide for them. And it's not about providing things to them. It's really about what do we do to foster long-term public safety. And you have to actually provide people with the opportunity to change, which are vocational programs, educational programs, treatment programs, access to their families, work opportunities, and then a lot of enrichment programs too. Because a lot of these individuals, we say rehabilitation, but a lot of them haven't actually been habilitated. So there's a lot of things that we have to establish to give them the tools to succeed. And women have a different pathway into the criminal justice system. So the large majority of the women have a lot of trauma histories with low self-esteem, a lot of abuse and sexual abuse. And so there's a lot of things that they need in addition to just even some of those basic things. And we just don't have the services out in New England, North Dakota that we would be able to provide if they were here in Bismarck. One of the things that we have a very rich, robust volunteer volunteerism. So we're able to do things without a lot of taxpayer dollars to supplement some of the things that we're bringing into our male facilities here in Bismarck. And those opportunities just are not there in New England. It's such a far drive from anywhere.
And to talk a little bit about, because when we started the interview, you said one of the reasons why we have the women's prison in New England in the first place was there was sort of this economic argument made 15 or so years ago where they came in and said, this is great, we can house these prisoners cost effectively, it'll create jobs in Western North Dakota. The legislature went for it. Now it seems we're making that same argument to resist change. And I guess I'm sitting over here thinking, listen, we don't create prisons as jobs programs. Prisons exist to, carry out the sentencing for people who have broken the law, but then also hopefully rehabilitate them and release them back into the public once their sentences are complete, ready to be upstanding citizens and get jobs and pay their taxes and follow the laws and all those good things. So this economic argument to me is very frustrating.
Well, it is frustrating, and this is a very expensive mistake to be making. So over 12% of our incarcerated population is women. That's a very, very high percentage. In fact, the percentage of women incarcerated in California is only 4.5%, and the national average is around 6 or 7%. There's a reason we're well above the national average on incarceration rates for women. It's because we're failing to provide them with the necessary tools. The economic argument is really, really concerning, because if you're really talking about doing something good for taxpayers, we're wasting a lot of state taxpayer dollars on having the women out in New England. I think if we were able to finally do services for incarcerated women correctly, that we would see the total number of women that are incarcerated in our system drop significantly. We would see a lot fewer families impacted by the intergenerational trauma of continued incarceration in some of these families. The economic argument to keep the facility there is really not a viable one. The economics in North Dakota are much different than they were in 2003. Job Service did a study, and there's over 800 open jobs in that area. The lack of a workforce is the number one factor facing economic growth in North Dakota, so there's way more jobs. And in fact, Job Service indicated that they are ready to assist if they would match people up with those jobs, and if their training does not meet the open positions right now, they could offer job training to those individuals. So, and very few people who actually work at the prison live in New England. So over half of them commute from Dickinson, and there's a very robust job market in Dickinson, North Dakota at this time.
I agree with all of that. And also just to buttress some of what you're saying, I mean, yeah, is there an economic boon to having to that local area, to having the prison in New England? I imagine that there probably is. It drives some commerce. It obviously drives some jobs. Okay, fine. There's also an economic cost, though, to not serving these prisoners appropriately. A prisoner who doesn't have an adequate GED program and doesn't get that education is more likely to come out of prison and commit crimes. A prisoner who doesn't have connections to their children or their family or their friends and those positive connections to bring them out after this experience in prison, they're more likely to commit more crimes and continue being a drag on society. There's an economic cost to that as well. And we can't just ignore it because, hey, there's some new jobs in New England.
Right. And 75% of our incarcerated women are mothers with children under the age of 18. So we're impacting families, we're impacting kids, and that has a huge taxpayer financial burden on the social welfare system. And so a number of these children end up in foster care, a number of the kids end up in the juvenile justice system, a number of the kids end up with some adverse outcomes with their behavior and their mental health problems being so far removed from their parent. So we know what the research says about keeping those attachments even when the parent is in prison, and the women do not have that same opportunity. And certainly throwing more money at that facility is not going to change their geographical location.
So right now, the House just turned their version of this bill into a study. Where are we at? I mean, is this issue dead for this legislative session?
Nope, this is just the first period of the legislative session. We plan on going forward with the executive recommendation in the Senate, and we'll see how successful we are in getting them to understand the serious needs that we have in our correction system when it comes to providing services to these women.
Leann, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That's it for today's Plain Talk. Remember, new episodes come out every weekday morning. You can subscribe on the podcasting platform of your choice. We should be available on any of them. And if you're having any trouble subscribing to the podcast, listening to the show in any way, or if you just got feedback, and what am I doing something right? Am I doing something wrong? Do you have something you want to add to something that we've covered? Email it, rob@sayanythingblog.com. Sometimes I read some of the feedback on the show, so if you send me some good feedback or some feedback that's interesting, you may even read it on the podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.